Welcome everybody to the Seen and Heard podcast, a conversational series. Today I have the great honour of being joined by Louis de Bernières. Louis is a celebrated British novelist, best known for Captain Corelli's Mandolin, which won the Commonwealth Writers' Prize and became a major film. His writing blends history, politics and deeply human stories. He attended Grenham House, a boys' prep boarding school in Kent, an experience he later described as hellish due to its culture of cruelty, a theme that subtly echoes in his work. A former school teacher and keen musician, he has also published poetry, short stories and children's books. With wit, lyricism and emotional depth, Louis continues to captivate readers and listeners worldwide, and he's here speaking with us today. Welcome, Louis.
Very much. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's a real honour to speak to you, and I think when we were connecting in recent months, it was an article that was out there in the press around your time at school that really sort of sparked my interest in having a conversation with you around that part of your life, but also around your work, because your catalogue of work is incredible, both on the music side and on the novel, short stories, poems, etc. So thank you so much for making the time.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I would love to start the podcast, as I always do, by understanding a little bit more about someone and where they came from. So, how were things for you when you were young, and what brought you to later, speak about your time at school?
Before Grenham House, my childhood was really rather nice. Although my parents did believe in spanking, which was not something I would approve of now, but it was completely normal then. But my mother was very, very loving at the same time as being highly critical. She, for example, taught us to read. I think we were just sitting on her knee probably and following her finger along the lines. And I think I could read before I ever went near a school. I don't ever remember learning to read, and I think that's how it happened. Just because of my mother's habit of reading us stories on her knee with us following her finger. My father was an army officer to begin with, which is fantastically glamorous. He'd get picked up in the morning in a huge sort of Jeep-like thing called a Champ. A very handsome Batman he had, who picked him up, and he'd be off in his uniform, And my mother told me, he had had a great war and he was as brave as a lion, and we had pet rabbits and pet cats and a golden retriever, and living in one small army house after another. And that was, I've got very fond memories of that. Particularly, I can remember the day when I first came to consciousness. I was standing in a field of yellow flowers, and suddenly I was conscious of being in a field of yellow flowers and thinking, oh, wow. Now, I asked my mother about this a few years ago, and she said, yes, there was a meadow opposite our house in one of these places full of yellow flowers. But obviously everything changed. I went to a primary school at the top of the hill in Orpington called St Nicholas's, and it was a little school. It used to be a golf club, clubhouse, and the teachers were sort of mostly middle-aged ladies, sort of quirky middle-aged ladies, as only the English can produce. And the nicest thing about, I'd go to school with my hamster in my blazer pocket, and my sister and I would roller skate down the hill to get home afterwards. And we're going so fast, we had to crash into the garage door to stop. And my father painted the door, and
It's always good to have a visitor. I love that.
my father painted the door one day, so we weren't allowed to crash into it anymore. This is Minou.
Welcome to the podcast.
Yes, he will do everything. There's two other cats who will also intervene at some point.
Maybe stay away. Yeah.
Everything changed when I got sent to this school called Grenham House. I was only sent there because my parents knew somebody who had their boys there, and it was run by two headmasters, both of whom I think were pedophile, and at least one of them was highly sadistic. He had been tortured by the Germans during the war. He had horrendous scars across his back, And I think now that he was taking it out on us, so that you would get thrashed if you got more than 5 bad conduct marks in a week, called Connor marks. And you could get thrashed for all sorts of other things as well. He would clear the furniture in his study, and he had a case full of canes of different kinds, with knobbles on or whatever. And he'd clear the furniture, and you'd be ordered to bend over, sometimes in your pajamas, and he'd take a run up before he hit you, and he had really immaculate aim. He could get you in the same spot 6 or 12 times in a row, and afterwards you would, over the next week or so, you'd be a row of cuts, deep cuts with yellow, blue, black, green bruising. And the other headmaster hardly ever beat anybody, and he had a squiffy eye, so he wasn't a good shot anyway. But his thing was putting his hands up your shorts. I don't know how far this went, if it ever went too far. But the thing about being a little child is that you think that everything that grown-ups do must be normal. You have sort of no right to complain or question. It doesn't even occur to you to question it. And you don't tell your parents you've been thrashed, because it's kind of shameful to admit that you've done something wrong. So even the nicest parents simply didn't know what was happening. Now, in the end at that school, there was a boy who was Jewish. He wasn't particularly misbehaved, and he was thrashed so often. One day he put his hands over his backside to try and protect himself, and the headmaster broke his fingers. And his parents threatened to sue. And at the same time, the headmaster, rather surprisingly, got married to a very nice woman. And suddenly that was the end of the violence from the headmaster. Suddenly we had carpets, suddenly the heating was turned on. So the people who came after me had a much better experience than I did. But I think what bothers me is that because of the violence from the headmaster, I mean, for example, he'd twist your cheek and call you insulting names. Because of that precedent set by the headmaster, the whole school was rife with violence. There was terrible bullying. Older boys, when your boys are about 13, some of them can suddenly grow up and get very big. And of course, some of us were tiny little people, 7 or 8 years old, and remorselessly bullied. I think tortured. We had, for example, a thing called the prickly bush, and the first thing that happened to you when you arrived as a tiny little boy was you were thrown in the prickly bush. So there was that to contend with, all that violence, and quite a lot of psychological torture. We had a disabled boy who was tormented so much that in the end his parents had to take him away. I think he practically had a nervous breakdown. But from an emotional point of view, I've always wondered why, even though my mother and I had such a good relationship, I always felt a sort of inner rage, an anger, which poisoned our relationship to some extent. I mean, she was a great mother. She did all the things that fathers are supposed to do. She taught me to play squash and tennis, and she taught me to play golf. She sat for hours whilst I didn't catch any fish at the local lake, But I always had this kind of resentment inside me, and until a few years ago, I didn't understand that it was because of having been abandoned at the age of 8. The sense of abandonment is it's such a shock that on the first day of term, you're suddenly not allowed to cry. You don't get or receive any affection. You're sort of, it's like being thrown into a tribe of, into a foreign tribe whose ways you simply do not understand and can't cope with. And of course, having endured all this, violence and deprivation, you get to the first day of the holidays, you're back home and you're back on your mother's knee and you're trying to become a little boy again. And that emotional switching is very hard to pull off, and I feel really our innocence was abused. The headmasters knew that we couldn't complain. They every Sunday morning we had to write a letter home, and obviously it was censored, so you couldn't say anything negative about anything at the school. The beatings would stop 2 weeks before the end of term, so that nobody went home with a bruised arse. And the diet was so bad. Sometimes our supper was 2 tin tomatoes on a slice of white toast. You either had diarrhea or you were constipated. Yeah. Almost all of us had threadworms, which are pretty hard to get rid of. In the winter there was frost inside the windows, which is, I must say, is one of those beautiful things I've ever seen. But we weren't allowed to wear trousers until we were 13 or something. So we little boys in the winter of '63, we had weeks of the sea froze. We were walking on the sea, and we had to wear shorts. So you'd have these red raw sort of chaps up the insides of your thighs, and chilblains on your feet, which made it painful to walk. And I mean, my theory at this safe distance is that practically all of our masters had been through the Second World War, or the First World War, and I think they themselves had some sort of PTSD, and I think that they were actually preparing us for the Third World War. We were being trained up to be little Spartans, tough as nails. We were tough, and vicious when we had to be. So I'm certain that they were hoping to produce reliable little warriors for the next war. All of the dormitories were named after military commanders. Haig, Cunningham, Beatty, Nelson, all of these things. And anyway, that's my theory, that we were being trained up to be warriors. And it is true that along with the psychological damage, you become physically pretty tough. And you at the end of it all, you come out with a rather strange kind of self-confidence, which you often find in people who've been to private schools. They seem quite poised and yes, confidence is the word, confident, but you give them a hug and they're as stiff as a board. The school, you can become emotionally closed in a way that if you don't deal with it, it will carry on getting at you for the rest of your life. It will spoil your relationships. I mean, I can remember when I was about 17. By then I was at a much, much nicer school. When I was about 17, I felt that I was sort of bursting, sort of like some horrible torrent was being dammed up. And I actually sat in the attic of my parents' house in Surrey and taught myself to cry. And it was a very, very good thing to do for me, I think. It was essential. If I hadn't done that, I would be a completely different person now. And strangely enough, now I tend to cry rather too easily. If I see something beautiful or somebody says something sentimental, it makes me tearful. But I'd rather be like that. I really would. But being dammed up is it's the most isolating thing. And I think most people who are dammed up don't even know how isolated they are. if you are dammed up, it means it's very hard even to relate to your own children. Yeah. I mean, I know that these private schools, the boarding schools, often have the most wonderful facilities. So you can have, there aren't many state schools with a squash court or a fives court or 12 playing fields and a vast swimming pool. You don't find that in the state system. And you sometimes get these wonderful teachers who are completely fired up with their subject and wouldn't have been able to cope with being in the state system, because that's tough. It's very largely about class control much of the time. It's not like that so much in the private sector. So you can get highly talented teachers who can pass on their enthusiasms. You've got very small classes, so you get more attention. So I know that there are great advantages if you can afford all that. But after my experience, I was just absolutely determined to send my kids to the local comprehensive. They've done perfectly well, perfectly well. And one of the bonuses of it is that they've got all their friends locally. If you get sent away to a boarding school, your friends are at the boarding school. You come home, you don't really have any friends in your village anymore. I mean, I possibly only had 2 friends in my village because I really wasn't there very much. But my children are surrounded by their friends. And I think the advantage of growing up in a village is pretty great. I was going to add something to that, but it suddenly slipped my mind. Yeah, I mean, my children grew up with the 3 children next door. We were a big family, really, one big family. Their parents said, "Oh, if we die, will you have our kids?" It was lovely. I mean, I even got a car that can have 7 seats, far bigger than any car I could possibly want, because at one time I had 5 kids. But those 3 were all sent off to private schools, and I don't think any of them now have any friends around here at all, apart from my kid. So I think it's a bit sad. Have I talked too much?
No, not at all, Louis. It's so moving for me because everything you've said so far resonates with me very deeply. Obviously, my personal experience,
Yeah.
but yeah, hearing that change from home life into school, it just breaks my heart to hear how school was. With sadistic heads, the beatings, the cold, the food. A lot of that resonates with my experience. Many years later in the 80s. It was still going on in the 80s through till the Children's Act started to sort of move through a few of the real sort of institution sponsored violence in the 90s, but it didn't mean obviously that the problems went away. They just changed.
Sorry to interrupt. I have the impression that things are enormously better now. In this, you go to a public school now and you find they've got ensuite bathrooms, and they can get on their smartphones and message home as much as they like. They can talk to their parents on the phone, do video calls, like this one, and there's far more time. We were only allowed out 2 weekends in that. In fact, I think it was just a Sunday. My parents would have to drive up and take me out for egg and chips on a Sunday. But now they're allowed out an awful lot more, and they're coming home, and it seems much more child friendly. But I still think that probably these kids might, a number of them anyway, might still be feeling this strange sense of abandonment. Like, why have I been expelled from my little home? What's wrong with me that I can't be at home all the time? I fear that that's the one big remaining problem, but I don't know if I'm right about that. It's just a feeling.
No, thank you. Look, I think you are right that that's going to remain in many cases, and then particularly to add to that, you've got something that hasn't changed at all, which is that a lot of the schools are real sort of hot educational hothouses, and the timetabling is ruthless. So day pupils are on a 60-hour week, the boarders are on a 90-hour week. That's always going to gear up a nervous system for you know. Uh, for burnout, really, because there's very little downtime. So that's very much still around, and I think also there's, as you touched on so beautifully when you went, there was no love, there was no appropriate touch. In an institution, no matter how benign, no matter how well-meaning, those things will be absent because, especially with safeguarding as it is now, which is welcome, um, to touch the children, in a thoughtful, appropriate way is absolutely a no-go zone really now. So, between the sort of being away from home, between the academic and the timetabling rigor, and between the lack of kind of touch and nurture, that those will still be missing.
Yeah, it's the same in the state system now, though. When my children went to the primary school and I became a governor, I discovered that the staff weren't allowed to comfort the children physically if they hurt themselves. I think they could do this. And I said, I'm sorry, I want you to, if my child falls over and hurts themselves, I want you to give them a proper hug. I'll do it properly. And I don't suppose they took me seriously, but that's how I felt. I thought, there's clearly no sexual danger to a little child who's fallen over in a playground surrounded by other children and teachers. It's absurd that you can't give them a hug or pick them up and give them a cuddle. It has in those cases, I think, gone much too far.
Yeah.
We're an inhibited race anyway. Why are we making ourselves worse? If I meet my male friends in Turkey, it's all hugs and kisses on each cheek, maybe 4 or 5. In England or Britain, there is nothing more embarrassing than the failed English male hug.
Or I always say as well, when you get a hug and they're pushing the eject button straight away, the hand on the back, which basically says that's enough.
Yeah.
That's,
I haven't noticed that one.
Yeah, I noticed that one a bit. No, thank you for sharing it and hearing. It was very moving when you talked about when you were 17. Finding a quiet space in the house and teaching yourself to cry and feeling that sort of overwhelm of emotion that was coming up, and crediting that very much for setting you on a different course, perhaps. Many don't find that until the sort of classic midlife breakdown at some point, or perhaps ever, and that really is quite a tragedy to live a life without an emotional range.
Yeah, and if your partner is a sort of a normal person, it's very difficult for them. They find it terribly puzzling as to why you're emotionally unavailable. It's frustrating and annoying. It's rather like the feeling I had with my dad, that I knew he loved us, but he simply could not say so. And I think one's personal relationships, having been through that system, can be made much more difficult by your partner simply not understanding why you are as you are.
Yeah, you mentioned your parents. Were either of your parents? Did either of them go to boarding school?
Oh yes, they both did.
Both went. Yeah.
The second one I went to was called Bradfield, and it still exists, and it's much more humane than the prep school. But my only complaint about Bradfield is that I would rather have been at home. But with the dog and the cats and fishing on the village pond, all that kind of thing, which I loved. So yeah, my father went to Bradfield, and that's the only reason I went there. My mother, on the other hand, went to a progressive school in Sussex called Bedales, which was, even back then, was very liberal and much more humane than most schools at the time. And also, her dad worked there. So she sort of was with her family every day. So for people like them, it was just without question the right thing to do to send your kid to a fee-paying school. They didn't question it. It was if you weren't doing that, people thought you were stingy, or there was something wrong with you, or you were socially incompetent. You lost face amongst your friends, and so I got my 11 plus. I could have gone to Guildford Grammar School. There was, in fact, a public school a mile away from me over the hill. It's called, I think, King Edward's at Whitley, only a mile away. I could have been a day boy and just gone back and forth. But a perfectly good local private school, if you have to go private. And my parents did what they thought they had to do, even though they didn't really have enough money to do it. I mean, my father worked for a charity, so that they scrimped and saved and to do the right thing. And at this distance, it just looks like the wrong thing.
Thank you. Yeah, that speaks a lot to me. I think having had a dad who went bankrupt paying school fees, because it was agreed in a divorce that I would go to a boarding school. It's very difficult to sort of see that, because I think there was that sort of double bind extra layer where if you said anything about the school, if you said you're having a good time, or maybe you didn't do very well at sport or tests or something, then don't you know how much that costs? Argument sort of came out. And of course, as a child, you then go, well, it must be me. I must be complaining. I must be what's wrong here, because this is a great privilege. This comes at huge sacrifice to the family, and therefore I've just got to stiff upper lip and get on with it. And there must be something wrong with me. So I think as you said, the young person will always internalizes everything. The adults are right, I am wrong, and therefore I've just got to kind of get on with it.
Yeah. You have so little autonomy as a child. I think sometimes we grown-ups forget that.
Yeah, I've heard it said that you mentioned our sort of society, our country, we do not kind of recognise and respect the needs of young people as much as other countries and cultures, and that's been endemic for quite a long time, certainly since Industrial Revolution and Victorian era, etc. We not that many countries were always sending people up the chimneys, and boarding schools and the private school system have somewhat reinforced, I think, that children should be seen and not heard, and are there to be sort of sent away and come back when they're fully functional.
Well, the difference is that in most cultures, that the children actually do work. 30 years ago, Turkey was practically run by little boys, but it's in the context of a loving and supportive family and an extended family. It's in that context, so that the child makes their contribution, but not somewhere else.
You mentioned that the sort of extended family and the way you've raised your children and the neighbours, etc. That kind of takes a village to raise a child, and so with your view on how things are, perhaps in the modern system, what are your thoughts on it? How it will continue as whether it's boarding schools or private schooling? Have you got a view on where it goes next and its future?
I do actually. I often go into schools, and I don't discriminate whether they're state schools or private schools. From my point of view, a teenager is a teenager, or a child's a child. I'm not going to be snotty about whether they're working class or middle class like me. And it's impossible not to notice that a greater and greater proportion of the kids are actually from abroad. That they are rather ironically being bought the British educational experience, but because there's so many of them, it's actually not that British anymore. Do you follow me? And the facilities are getting better and better, but that means that the prices are getting higher and higher. So people who routinely would have sent, middle class people who would routinely have sent their children to private school now can't afford to. So that their kids are going into the state system. And those pushy middle class parents are having the effect of raising standards in the public sector to the point, I think, where it's actually pointless to send your kid to a private school. It's not really that much better, you know. And of course, you get the advantage of actually living with your children, and giving them a good diet and so on and so forth. So I think many prep schools have closed down. Not many people believe anymore in sending children away to board at the age of 6 or 7 or 8. It's much more likely to happen when they're 13 or so, and at puberty, your emotional focus shifts from your family and your parents to your peer group. So if you are going to send a kid away, it's better to do it at that kind of age, where being with the peer group is actually more fun and interesting for them than to be with your parents. But so the prep schools are disappearing, and I think the private schools are going to become steadily less populated by British pupils. Sorry about that.
It's okay.
Mini.
Yeah. Yeah, I can hear you. I mean, I've just been writing an article, as you know, that you've contributed to. Very grateful for that. It's Boarding School Right for My Child, which is a parent-focused piece that looks at the whole sort of sector and all the difficult competing decisions that parents go through.
I will say one thing, though. I did have one friend who is still my from school, from Bradford, who is still my friend, and he says his family was just so ghastly and so dysfunctional that being at school was an absolutely blessed relief. So possibly the best reason for going to a boarding school is if your family is totally crap.
Yeah. I think that's often the one when I speak to proponents of the sector, if you like, or one of the associations that runs the sector and things like that. That will often be one of the main reasons, which is, effectively the boarding system rescues people from difficult home lives. And
my friend Peter thinks it rescued him.
Yeah, I mean, I went to boarding school for primarily that reason, for stability and to be in an environment that was going to be a bit more wholesome than home potentially. That said, I think what's important is that people realise it is most likely out of the frying pan and into the fire, as far as there is a different kind of effect that you're going to receive at boarding school. So it might be safer and less ghastly than the family at home that you've described, but there is, if you send someone who's got poor attachment from a difficult home life into a institutional setting, psychologically there's a doubling down effect, if you like. There isn't a rescuing, there is a doubling down. So yeah, the person may well survive quite well, have peers around them, there may well be other things that happens. They will then have a lot of unpacking to do later on. So if it's recognized that that is the case, then I think that there can be, that can be a good example. But you're right, for some people they absolutely thrive, and they will stand by that as long as they lived it. It was the making of them, and it was the best experience of their life. And I never argue with those people. I usually just ask, was there bullying? Yes, there was terrible bullying. Would you rather have been at home? Well, I would have been. Home might have been difficult, but I would rather have had a home life. And did anything happen to you there that you now look back on and think wasn't okay? And most people will say yes. And so it can be the making of them, but when you answer yes to those three questions, it tends to start to raise a thought as to, okay, there may be something to look at here. Not about dismissing it, but there's something to unpack.
I think the ones who think positively of it as the making of them are more than likely owing that feeling to one or two inspiring and lovable teachers. So, my friend Peter was with the Garsley family. He was really obsessively interested in biology. I mean, he used to spend his time cutting up moles, and we had a couple of really charming, humorous, clever biology teachers. And probably the reason for his positive experience of that school is just because of those two teachers. And similarly, at my brutal prep school, there were a couple of teachers to whom I will always be grateful. But actually, that would be true if I'd gone to a state school as well, or if I'd been to Guildford Grammar. I would have 2 or 3 teachers who had a profound influence on me, I think.
Mm.
So your positive feelings are personal ones, I think, about the people there that you got fond of, or to whom you owe a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I have someone like that from my second prep school, absolutely. And you referenced the friend thing when you were speaking around coming home, not having friends in your sort of locality often where you live. I met up with some friends recently who I hadn't seen for 30 years or more. And what was strange, I found, was that the speed at which I moved on from them when I moved schools or moved areas, they effectively ceased to exist almost the minute I went home for the summer holiday and didn't go back. So we were reflecting on that together, and one of my friends said, "Oh, you were my best friend. You didn't come back in September, and by week 2, I'd got a new best friend." And I thought, absolutely, it was the same for me when I went to my new school. I forgot the name of my best friend from 2 months before.
Yeah.
That level of dissociation and just kind of forward momentum is quite remarkable, and I do see it quite consistently. However, some people have held friendships from childhood all the way through life. So.
Yeah, I've recently reconnected with my fellow victims. We've been meeting in a pub in Wandsworth every few months, about 9 or 10 of us, and there's only one of us who thinks that he wasn't fucked up by it, who wasn't damaged. And oddly enough, he was beaten quite a lot. But yes, and it's I actually never did forget them or their names or anything. If I can look at the old school photograph and identify most of the people there.
Wow.
But and the other thing that's been happening is that the nice thing about meeting up with these people is having it confirmed that you haven't got fake memories, that you haven't made it all up, because they all remember exactly the same things. Or sometimes they remember things which you had almost forgotten. Like I'd almost forgotten the other headmaster putting his hands up your shorts all the time. And I was reminded of course he did. He'd sit you on his knee and in front of the whole class with his hand up your shorts. But the other thing that's happened is that ever since I started writing those articles for newspapers and things, I've had people come to my events, to my readings. For example, a solicitor in the West Country wrote me a letter and came to see me because he'd been through it all, and he was actually grateful that somebody had brought it to light. So I've been connecting with that. I now have a little sort of network of I suppose ex-friends or fellow victims who look back on it all with a certain kind of humorous ruefulness. Yeah, and we all have this feeling that there's just nothing we can do about it. I mean, who are we supposed to sue? And who cares about posh boys anyway? I said, when Charles Spencer brought his book out recently, I said to him, yeah, but who cares about posh boys? It's like people think, oh, well, you're so privileged, you deserve that in some perverse way.
Thank you, Louis. I think that the privilege element is one of the most challenging things that's seen and heard. We a lot of the time we get people coming to us who are at the very start of their journey of sort of unpacking this bit, looking at this part of their life. They might be in their 20s or 30s or often 60s, 70s, 80s and beyond. And it's the very first time they're opening the door on this. usually because something's happened in life, a breakdown physically, mentally, their parents have died and they're not protecting them anymore, or their children have reached the age at which they were when they went off to school, and that tends to bring up a load of stuff. But the privilege myth is the shame around that is one of the hardest things to start unpacking.
Yeah, I didn't mention any of this to my parents because I knew that they had sacrificed so much, and I always thought they'd done the right thing. I didn't have the heart to tell them what a ghastly mistake it had been. So I only started really going on about this after my father died, and at the age of 96. I waited a long time.
It's a long time to carry that, and particularly when you talk about the abuse side of things. I think that from the Independent inquiry into child sex abuse showed that sort of only 1 in 9 people who are abused ever say anything, and on average that can take up to 27 years to come out. And when you look at that, it's easy to see why the shame, protecting families, and everything that goes around it. So sort of societally, it's the truth coming out is incredibly difficult. No, thank you. I mean, from your perspective, then that journey from starting to get in touch with your emotions, you say crying at 17 and starting to feel that stuff coming through. See, so much of your writing is so passionate, so deep. What was the journey through for you from sort of late teens, early adulthood into the work and the writing that you went on to do? What was your path?
My path was very roundabout and strange. For some reason, I think I was quite heavily affected by the hippie revolution, for which I arrived a little bit too late. But that I just didn't want to have to do a job where you had to wear a tie, or put on a suit and go into an office. I just didn't want to do that. I wanted proper jobs, So I mean, I worked. I got myself through university as a landscape gardener. What they call hard landscaping, so building things out of stone, really. Garden construction. I mean, I didn't know anything about plants until quite recently. So I did a lot of landscape gardening. I worked on a ranch in South America for a year. I was teaching the kids on the ranch up to O-level standard, believe it or not. And in the afternoons, I was out there with my 3 horses lassoing cattle, which is a thoroughly liberating experience. But the trouble with that kind of liberation is that when you come home, for example, I came home to go to university in Manchester in 1974, and it was the most dismal place on earth. Everything was broken, everything was filthy, everyone had a bad attitude, they didn't like Southerners, so it rained all the time, and so in a way, Colombia set me up for a disappointment on my return home. And the consequence of that was, I mean, that in the 10 years after I came back, I read nobody but Latin American writers to take me back. And that's why my first 3 novels were sort of fake Latin American ones, which I was happy with. But I mean, I had so many jobs. I was a motorcycle messenger once for a while. I worked as a carpenter. I worked 2 stints in a mental hospital as a gardener, where the staff are far nuttier than the patients. That's hilarious. What else have I done? For a long time, I trained as an English and drama teacher in Leicester. I did 3 years in Ipswich, which was difficult for me because, well, for emotional reasons. I think one of the odd things that going to a single-sex boys' boarding school does to you is that it makes you idealize women. You if you're heterosexual, you come out thinking that women are these beautiful princess-like creatures who will give you happiness and fabulous sex and everything. And in others, women are the fount of paradise. And because of having that sort of unrealistic expectation of women, I think it spoilt my relationships quite a lot, because women are real people who are hoping for the same sorts of things from you, actually, and being equally let down. So, yeah, I've forgotten how I got onto that topic. But then, anyway, I trained as an English and drama teacher. I did 3 years in Ipswich, where I was having a sort of two heartbreaks, and then I quit that and became a supply teacher in London for a long time, which I loved. I was in South West London. I was working for Wandsworth Borough Council after the IAA was abolished, and I had to teach every subject pretty much at the drop of a hat. But it was nice because I had no actual preparation or marking to do, hardly ever, which meant that I could go home at 4 o'clock and start writing. And it wasn't until I was earning the same by writing as I was by being a supply teacher that I took the fatal leap and gave up teaching, thinking I could become a full-time writer.
Mm.
My mother was absolutely horrified. She wanted me to get a PhD in case I failed as a writer.
Mm. So from those years of education,
I had lots and lots of jobs, and
yeah.
I even had 5 months in the army. So I actually do know what it's like to freeze all night in a trench on Salisbury Plain, and I understand comradeship, which civilians don't. Comradeship is a special kind of love that only people like soldiers and sailors have, and civilians simply don't comprehend it. And I'm very, very glad that I have experienced comradeship. But you see a pair of socks hanging over the back of a chair, and you know straight away whose socks they are, just by the shape of them. It's rather wonderful that. So and
I was going to ask, just from your time in education, obviously some of the work that we do, Seen and Heard, is in schools trying to improve wellbeing and welfare. When you started to transition across to writing, is there anything you took out of the education system as you saw it, or what you've seen since with your children, or as a teacher? Is there anything that sort of stayed with you?
I think one of the things is that children left to their own devices, as you often are in a long unsupervised time at boarding school, left to their own devices, things do quite quickly degenerate into the Lord of the Flies. I'm quite conscious as a parent, or as an adult, that one of my functions is to sort of civilize the little savages. But you do it. You do it gently and with love and with reason. Obviously, like any parent, I have occasionally shouted at my kids, but I try not to. And I've always found that if you try and keep things reasonable, you explain. If they come up with an opinion, you give them the opposite opinion, because you want them to know how other people, So if my kids came home full of communism, I'd tell them what was great about capitalism, or vice versa. I think they. I think being a teacher makes you realise how important it is for adults and children to have intelligent and deep engagement with each other. Yeah, that you can't just hive them off. There are nice ways of hiving you off. I mean, my mother, for example, when I was very little, and we thought that the world was safe, she'd say, "Go out and play and don't come back till it's dark." And you spend the whole day looking for newts in pools in the forest, or lying in the bracken with the dog. It was my childhood in the Surrey Hills in the school holidays was actually rather idyllic, and much of that consisted of just of benign neglect.
That rings a bell. yeah. Coming home when it's dark and you're hungry, and the rest of the day you're at the mercies of whatever was around. I do remember that in the 80s. So
yeah.
Well, thank you, and giving your view on what you took out of education and the work there. So as you started to, actually, something you touched on a little bit. So you touched on parenting there, and relationships before, where sort of holding women up on a pedestal. Was there anything else you felt that your early years, your boarding school, etc., sort of sent you out into the world with, that you've then had to work through as an adult? You mentioned sort of relationships or parenting or anything else.
Well, I try and put a positive spin on it all and I often tell my children this, is that if you want to know how to be a good parent, think about what your parents did, what was wrong with it, and don't do it yourself. And I hope that they've taken that message in, that if I've made mistakes or their mother has made mistakes, learning from other people's mistakes is just about the most important thing you can do, because it saves you making them yourself. So that's what I try and tell my kids. Okay, I may be crap in some respects, but you want to learn from that crapness and be better. The other thing I think that's very positive about my experience is that we were really, really very fit. We set ourselves up for a lifetime of fitness, physical fitness, and I'm thoroughly alarmed and disgusted by the way that kids just can spend hours scrolling about on their smartphones on a lovely sunny day, sitting indoors with pale faces scrolling about from one TikTok influencer to another. I find that's probably worse than a boarding school education, in my opinion, because they as you know, they get themselves into these horrible little rabbit holes where they can become overnight sexists or overnight fascists, or become obsessed with torture. I mean, or unusual sexual practices, and then we can't do anything about it because we sort of don't catch them at it. We don't really see what they're looking at, and I'm worried that their worldview is being distorted in a way that's different, but just as bad as happened to us.
Thank you, Louis.
But we were fit. And when my mother was old, she said, "Louis, you've got to enjoy your body while you're young. You've got to enjoy your body because one day it'll let you down." And that advice that my mother gave me is one that I always pass on to school kids and students myself.
Yeah, that physical self. It is very sad to see where so much screen time, particularly the social media side of things, going down the rabbit holes as you've talked about.
But the thing is, we are animals. If you that's I think the Romans used to say, mens sana in corpore sano, a healthy body and a healthy mind. They actually go together. You can't have one without the other. We're not divided selves. We're one unified creature, mind and body. If you don't understand that, you're never going to be happy or healthy.
No, something that we're working very hard on with schools is progressive, so well-being, welfare, importance of being outdoors, learning in nature, etc. It's much needed. I think now we need a return to that as much as possible. But so when you talked about relationships and sort of women on pedestals, how did you heal that wound in your adulthood? With your relationships,
I've never healed it.
Still there?
Yeah, I've never healed it. I mean, I think I tend to fall most passionately in love with women who treat me badly, and I think that's because I possibly have very low self-esteem and think I deserve it in some way. If I find a woman who is absolutely wonderful, very fabulous, gentle, kind, and so on, I find myself losing my patience quite quickly. I find this very, very hard to understand and deal with, and I don't know to what extent it's just me, or to what extent it's because of the way I've been shaped by my experiences.
Yeah, thank you.
I have. I mean, if you don't mind being a bit confessional, my last girlfriend treated me really quite badly. The one I have now is just absolutely perfect, and I had to keep telling her, "I'm sorry, but I really am trying to learn a new way to love. You've got to let me learn to love in a new way."
Mm, beautiful. Well, thank you for sharing that. And as you've been along your, with writing, with your music, the sort of cathartic nature of that, have you done therapy? Is there anything you found as an adult that, perhaps people are out there now looking, trying to work through this stuff? Is there anything you found along the way that was very helpful for you?
I've never tried therapy, um, which might be a kind of snobbishness, but I've never been short, or at least in recent years, I haven't been short of good friends, good friendships, people I can confide in, and of course they confide back, and you do. It's friendship therapy. I don't really feel I've ever needed the formal kind, but I might be wrong. I might be deluded about that. But I've always got by on friends. Um, I get a lot of fun and consolation out of my cats and other people's dogs. Um, I've got a lot of hobbies and interests which keep me busy and engaged, and I think that keeping busy is another thing which will get you through almost any crisis. Um, but only up to a point, because it will get you in the end. It's like alcohol. You can use wine to get you through your divorce, but and it will get you through. But it'll after 2 or 3 years, it won't be doing the job anymore.
No, I know that one. I know that one from first hand. I quit drinking. Quit drinking 4 years ago, but I relied on it heavily for decades, but yeah, for a bit too long. But thank you for sharing that, and yeah, hearing from your friendship and animals. We talked a bit about nature as well. Getting outside on a sunny day, and you said in recent years started to on the gardening side of things. You've got more interested in that rather than sort of just the landscaping part and the actual nature side of things.
Yeah, well, my generation, I think back in the 70s, people were watching The Good Life and thinking about self-sufficiency, and I tried it in Sussex, and of course, the pigeons ate all my brassicas, and my potatoes got full of they were drilled by something, beetles, I suppose, and it was a total failure. And I realised that self-sufficiency is actually a romantic dream unless you have an enormous amount of land and infinite time, or a huge family. So, but I still love, growing my own vegetables. I've got a decent sized vegetable patch, and for a while I simply couldn't be bothered with flowers. I thought they were sissy things, But now I'm into the flower beds as well. I have this passion for enormously tall hollyhocks. My parrot. If I ever get to paradise, I want it to be just full of 10-foot hollyhocks.
Sounds beautiful. We touched on as your transition then into writing. So, just tell us a little bit about how you mentioned at the start, first three novels, particularly reflecting back on your time in South America. What happened then? Not only what did you take into your writing from your life, some of the things we talked about, but the shape of the subject matter or the method, the delivery, whether it's short stories, poems, etc. How have you seen that change over the years?
There's been quite one significant radical change. In my first three novels, much to my own surprise and actual and anxiety, I discovered that what I was mainly interested in writing about was violence. I'd never ever thought of myself as somebody obsessed by violence, but when I started writing, I realized I was. It was all coming out. I mean, my first three books are really rather brutal. And there's a passage in the second one which is was so shocking, even to myself, that after I'd written it, I had to stop for a couple of weeks to recover. So it was a sort of, and I actually, in retrospect, put this down to the prep school experience. Having lived with months and months, years of relentless violence, emotional and physical, I suppose I should have realised that one day it would come out when I started writing. But after my first three novels, it was sort of purged. It was mostly gone. And after that, I realised that what I was writing about actually was love. I'm very interested in all the different kinds of human love. There are so many different kinds. It's not just four, C.S. Lewis thought. There's, the love between siblings, the love between parent and child, the love between friends, of whatever sex. There's the most strange one that we have, which other creatures don't seem to have, is our ability to create love in other animals. So, if you think about it, a cat would never hang around with a horse in the wild. Put them in a human context, and they get to adore each other and spend all their time together. A cockerel and a donkey. They wouldn't do that in the wild. But they do it because they're in this human environment where love actually counts for so much. I find okay, the ability of humans to be savage is pretty poor show, but our ability to spread love around ourselves is rather magical. And everything I've written since then really has been about relationships. But I have kept the sort of action side of things too. They always used to say, and I think it's true, that men are mainly interested in books in which lots of things happen, and women are interested in books about relationships. And with my books, I try and do both at once. And I think that's probably the single biggest reason why Captain Corelli's Mandolin was such a success. It was set in wartime, earthquakes, lots of things happening, but it was about love. So,
beautiful.
and I don't feel any inclination to change away from that path.
So there's still plenty of books left, or is there more poetry, more short stories, or is it just a combination? How does it flow from you?
I'm a bit of a fatalist. I mean, I'm also a bit of a pagan. I just think I'll just take what Apollo gives me. And if I wake up one morning with the urge to write a poem, then when I should be writing a novel, then I'm afraid I'll just go and write the poem. And so yeah, I greatly rely on the gods.
Mm-hmm.
And I had a phase of a few years where I was mainly interested in poetry, and that is just about to come back. You can feel it coming. It's like you can sense the new moon. So, and I have a new poetry publisher now. I've moved my poetry publishing to Ireland because the Irish understand and appreciate poetry and publish it so much better than the Brits do. I've just given up on us lot. So in a couple of weeks, I'm going over to Ireland to launch a collection in County Clare. And the other thing I need to do is, now that I'm 70, I've got to do something about all the unpublished work that's been accumulating since the 90s. And so I'm my intention, and I've done some of it, is to rewrite much of that, just to bring it up to date, so people have mobile phones. And I think all that unpublished stuff will keep me busy for quite a while. I don't really need to think of anything original until that's done.
Wow.
But when I started out in about 1990, I had a plan for all the novels I was ever going to write. I knew what they were. And I've now got to this really sad situation where I have actually written everything I ever planned to write. It's a bit disorientating and alarming, because It's like discovering you've got to the end of the pack of peanuts and you're still hungry.
Which for me is every time. I don't know what that says. Um, so you're in uncharted waters now.
I've only got a very small chart, enough for an estuary, but not enough for an ocean.
Yeah, beautiful.
But I don't know how long I'm planning to live. I mean, it'd be so much easier if I knew when I was going to die, then I could actually have a proper plan.
Well, hopefully for a long time. So plenty more to come. And are there any sort of subjects, any areas you feel drawn to go to more now as you get older, as you've written so much before?
I keep having brilliant ideas and then writing a couple of pages and realizing that it's even boring me. So I still think it'll be relationships that matter to me most. Yeah, but if you in the past, I've written historical novels largely, which take an absolutely enormous amount of research. You have to be highly committed to it, to work at it very hard, like a proper academic. And I'm beginning to feel that I'm losing that obsessive energy for doing research. And so in a way, what I'd like to do is write things that don't require any research. But if you do, the danger of that is you end up writing autobiography. Because obviously you already know you've done research by having lived it. And I don't want to move myself to the centre of the picture. I don't really like that idea. I don't want to be like the little kid doing somersaults on the lawn saying, well, look at me, look at me, look at me. Mummy, look at me. I don't really want to be like that. I sort of want to be more in the background. I mean, one reason I left London was that I'd rather be in the background. In the 90s, I had too much success with Captain Corelli's mandolin, and it was making me anxious. I was getting stalkers, strange, being door-stepped by journalists. So I moved out to Norfolk because they're all too bloody lazy to come this way.
And has for anyone who knows what they're looking at in the background, obviously there's plenty of music equipment there, and I know you're a fantastic musician. You've got recorded
my collection of rock and roll books behind me there. I think.
I can't quite see any titles, but so music being a huge part of your life as well. Just tell us a little bit about the music side. How did you find it, and what are you working on at the moment?
Well, my mother used to play us asleep in my grandmother's house on an upright piano. She'd play way down upon the Swanee River, and she or poor old Joe, with sort of what they used to call Negro spirituals and things, and but she couldn't help jollying them up, so they all came out like ragtime. We go to sleep to ragtime versions of really sad songs.
That's quite a niche.
Yeah. She could play by ear. She hadn't the clue how to read music. And then at this appalling prep school, there was a music teacher called Mrs. West who made us learn to sing all sorts of songs from the fellowship songbook, and I still got a copy somewhere. But when I was a teen, in my late teens, and as I said, the hippie revolution was underway, and almost everybody wanted to play the guitar. And if you were a bloke, being a good guitarist was the only way to get a girlfriend, unless you also had a car, So, and I initially got a guitar for the image more than anything, but I very, very quickly fell in love with it. And all through my life, I've been going from one sort of music to another. So I started out wanting to be Bob Dylan. Later on, I got interested in ragtime. I got interested in Baroque music because Baroque music is basically ragtime made sensible. And then I got interested in flamenco, classical guitar. I've been in, and I mainly like classical music and traditional music. I mean, for example, I love the music of Greece and Turkey and the Balkans. I love their dodgy scales. You know, where you can have a B flat and an F sharp in the same scale. I think it's just magic. Um, so I've had a problem with my fingers. I've had Dupuytren's contracture and focal dystonia in my right hand, and now I've got focal dystonia. Sorry, Dupuytren's contracture in this hand. Luckily, with the guitar and the flute, your fingers are curled anyway. But sooner or later, I'm going to have the operation. But it's made music difficult. And now, because of, so I can't be a red hot classical guitarist anymore, but I can go back to where I started, which is being a singer-songwriter. Because everything I know about poetry, I put into songwriting. And I come up with quite good melodies. They tend to be melancholy, but with very catchy choruses.
Mm.
So, you know, I played Edinburgh about 10 days ago, you know, and it was wonderful, you know. As long as you get the encore, that's all that matters. And
Yeah.
I do a gig about once a month. I don't really want to go on a world tour. I think that'll be an absolute killer, and I'd miss the kids and the cats.
Yeah, I understand when we chatted before. You've put some time in on the road. You've done some miles, haven't you? And you know it takes a lot out of you.
I did many years with some people called the Antonius Players. They were all better musicians than me, which was quite stressful in itself. But the relentless travelling, the time on the road, it just started to drive me bonkers. It was such wasted time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a tough gig on the road. So, yeah, are you working on any particular music at the moment? Are you looking at releasing anything,
Well,
or just?
I've got a fourth album which is nearly done. We're just waiting for a cellist to put some dubs on. I very recently did the music for a play in London. I've always wanted to do the music for a play. So an exiled Greek Cypriot called Maria Vigar wrote a play about being exiled Cypriots, and I did the music for it. I'm really pleased with that, and I think what I'll do is tidy up those recordings and maybe make an album of Balkan music or something. You know.
Cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's no signs of creativity slowing down just yet. There's loads of music going on, loads of and the off to Ireland soon for the poetry.
Yeah, but there are many signs of well-paid creativity being in decline. I seem to be attracted to the ones that don't earn anything these days.
Yeah, the passion projects.
Yeah.
Yeah. So with your will the poetry is it like an anthology that's going to be coming out from the Irish publishers?
Well,
Or
the plan is to reissue my previous collections with collections of new poetry in between each re-edition. So the one coming out now will be my original first collection. Then a couple of years later, it will be a collection of new stuff, and then the second original one. So with any luck, I'll end up with about 6 collections. But again, it all depends on when I'm planning to die, really.
Yeah. Not anytime soon. So plenty of room for collections to go.
Yeah.
But we'll make sure that
I have a lot of unpublished poetry, but it needs reworking.
Yeah. Okay. Fantastic. So it's good that we'll make sure that in the show notes from today's podcast that we've got links to all kind of the upcoming work that you're out there releasing, talking about now, as well as your back catalogue, if you like. What's the most recent novel that you're talking about and you're sharing?
Okay, it was called Light Over Liskeard, and it's the most fun I've ever had writing a book. I enjoyed writing it so much. I mean, I even enjoyed editing it, and it's the first thing I've published set in the near future, and really it's about someone who is a quantum cryptographer. In other words, he understands how the most advanced computers work, and he realizes that if he knows how to shut the world down, other people must know how to as well. So he buys a ruined farmhouse on Bodmin Moor where he and his family and his friends can survive. And although on the surface of it, it looks like science fiction, it's really my usual stuff about relationships. So, father and daughter, young love, old love, the love between separated spouses. So it's all about all those sort of things. And other things which I can see coming, like rewilding. One day we probably will have lynx and wolves and bears back again. It might even get bonkers enough for us to have mammoths. So, when that happens, I think a lot of people won't want to live in the countryside anymore. And it's about how people's lives are being taken over by technology to such an extent that they lose their sense of self. Or if AI is all it's cracked up to be, for example, and almost all our jobs can be done by that, the rest of us will have to be paid a universal basic income, and we will spend our time in a sort of fantasy land. Today I'll be a cavalier, tomorrow I think I'll be a yeti. The human race will become awfully purposeless. So it's really about human beings making themselves pointless, having no purpose or meaning to their lives other than to merely continue existing. You could have a mechanized heart that would work for 300 years, but your life might become perfectly pointless. So it's about all those sorts of things, and it's that sounds all sorts of depressing, but it's actually quite a funny book because much of it is taken up with mocking all of these things. My man is okay. He's a quantum cryptographer, and he's waiting for the end of the world when somebody switches off the grid. Which probably Putin could do tomorrow if he wanted to. But there are other people in the novel who are waiting for their version of the apocalypse. So there's somebody on top of a tour on Bodmin who's waiting for the return of Jesus Christ. There's somebody going round and round Dosmary Pool, waiting for the return of King Arthur. Somebody else is waiting for the return of the 13th Imam, and so everybody's expecting the end, but not all expecting it to happen in the same way. And I find that quite funny. I mean, that humans have always been obsessed with the apocalypse and the end of the world, and it sort of never succeeds quite in happening, does it?
Brilliant. Bug? Yes, I remember. Yeah. Wasn't quite the end of the world, was it?
The French did nothing about it, and nothing happened.
No. That sounds like a wonderful book, and they're raising some really interesting topics, especially around AI and kind of what it might bring us and how it might serve us. And I know everyone's really starting to get a view on that, and I have a very strong one myself. But it certainly is. It won't be the same anymore, and particularly back to education. AI is already radically changing the face of education out there, and what young people will need to bring on board. You mentioned when we chatted first that you still believe in a classical education, and I know you're very passionate about that.
Yeah, and I know you believe the opposite.
It's okay. and I think that's very healthy. We have different ways of coming at it, but I think that there's many benefits. I know I use my education every day, and I'm very, very grateful for so many elements of it. I just wish there had been a little bit more in there to teach, help me learn how to human rather than having to work it all out at 40 years old on a breakdown.
Yeah, the fashion for the whole child. It kicked in the 1960s, didn't it? But it didn't kick in properly for 3 decades later.
No, at least, yeah. It's sort of dripping in now. I don't know about kicking in, it's dripping in.
Think of the schools we went to. There was virtually no pastoral care.
No.
Now every school has someone you can go to when you're desperate.
Yeah, I think that the key is just some more proactive stuff. So I think there's better reactive stuff out there. More people to pick up the pieces. I'm passionate about there being less pieces to pick up, and I think that can be done. But it's been such a wonderful conversation, Louis. Was there anything, just as we start to bring things to a close, and I could chat to you all day because it's really enjoyable. Was there anything you feel that you wanted to touch on, or anything that you feel we haven't covered, or any sort of final kind of thoughts for people?
Well, I mean, obviously, I'll think of half a dozen things after we've, this afternoon.
I have to come back another time. We'll do.
Think of anything just now. I think it's been a good conversation. Covered a lot of ground.
Yeah, it's been wonderful, and I've just enormously appreciated your honesty of how things have been for you along the way, and so exciting to hear that there's more work coming. On with the poetry, with the writing, with the music, and also you mentioned when you're out speaking to kids in classes and schools and things like that. So and taking the time to have conversations like this, it's very much appreciated. So yeah, I think we'll bring things to a close and say a huge thank you to you, Louis, for your time today. And I'm Chris. Brach. This has been the Seen and Heard podcast conversational series, and do look out for other episodes. Like, share, follow, and all those sorts of things. So Louis, thank you so much for today.
Thank you too.
And look forward to speaking to you again sometime.
Yeah, it's good to talk.
Okay. Thanks very much, everyone. Goodbye.
Thank you.